Have you ever witnessed an act of heroism that unleashed consequences beyond human comprehension? Where gratitude transformed into something darker than anyone could have predicted? Deep in Thailand's hidden trafficking facilities, an elephant's courageous rescue of a drowning lion cub would forge bonds that seemed beautiful until freedom arrived. What the cub's mother did after liberation was so terrifying, so completely contrary to expected maternal gratitude, that it challenged everything experts believed about trauma, loyalty, and the dangerous psychology of apex predators pushed beyond their breaking point.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you.
Deep within Thailand's remote northern provinces, where dense jungles conceal some of Southeast Asia's darkest secrets, lies a hidden world of wildlife trafficking that operates beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement. This landscape encompasses thousands of square kilometers of impenetrable forest, where ancient teak trees create natural fortresses above illegal facilities designed to exploit the world's most magnificent creatures for international black markets. The jungle itself seems to harbor darkness, carpeted in perpetual shadows that conceal systematic torture, forced breeding programs, and the breaking of spirits that were meant to roam free. Hidden among these misty mountains are concrete compounds where criminal organizations conduct business that violates every principle of animal welfare and species dignity. Reinforced buildings blend into the forest canopy through careful camouflage, while constant humidity muffles sounds that would otherwise expose operations designed to reduce magnificent predators to mere commodities for wealthy collectors who view endangered animals as status symbols rather than sentient beings. But within these chambers of systematic exploitation, something extraordinary was about to unfold that would challenge our understanding of interspecies heroism, trauma bonding, and the dangerous psychological transformations that captivity can inflict on creatures whose natural behavioral patterns become twisted by years of systematic abuse. This is a place where the impossible becomes reality, where acts of courage can forge connections that transcend species boundaries, while simultaneously creating consequences that defy human prediction. What was about to develop in this hellish facility would prove that sometimes the most profound relationships emerge from the darkest circumstances, but that liberation can unleash forces more terrifying than the original captivity. This was a story that would challenge fundamental assumptions about gratitude, loyalty, and the psychological complexity of apex predators whose maternal instincts have been systematically perverted through trauma. The extraordinary events that were about to transform both rescuer and rescued would prove that in humanity's darkest corners, heroes emerge in unexpected forms, but that freedom can awaken something more terrifying than captivity, revealing that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who have learned that survival requires eliminating any threat to what they love, regardless of previous acts of heroism or compassion. Within the concrete walls of the illegal trafficking facility lived Chai, a 15-year-old male Asian elephant whose name meant victory in Thai. A cruel irony for a creature who had known nothing but defeat since being torn from his family as a juvenile and sold into a nightmare of systematic exploitation. Standing nearly 9 feet tall, despite chronic malnutrition, Chai's imposing frame was marked by countless scars from electric prods and chains, while his intelligent dark eyes reflected the accumulated trauma of a decade spent as entertainment for wealthy tourists who paid premium prices to ride broken spirits.
Chai had endured years of training that involved systematic torture designed to crush his natural behaviors and replace them with learned helplessness that made him profitable for the tourism industry. His remarkable memory and emotional intelligence, traits that made elephants such magnificent creatures in the wild, had become sources of additional suffering as he could remember freedom, understand his captivity, and process the reality that escape was impossible from reinforced enclosures designed by people who viewed him as valuable property rather than a sentient being. In the adjacent concrete pen lived Naran, a 4-year-old lioness whose name meant eternal in Thai, though her captors had assigned it mockingly since they planned to exploit her only until she became too dangerous to handle profitably. Standing just over 2 feet at the shoulder, but already showing the muscular development that would make her a formidable predator, Naran's golden coat had lost its natural luster through months of inadequate nutrition and psychological stress, designed to keep her manageable for breeding programs and photo opportunities. Naran had been separated from her pride as a 6-month-old cub, beginning a journey through international trafficking networks that specialized in supplying exotic animals to private collectors and illegal breeding facilities. Her developing intelligence allowed her to understand that she was trapped within a system designed to exploit her until maturity made her too dangerous for profitable management. Most heartbreaking was her 3-month-old cub, Kamon, whose name meant heart in Thai, a tiny lion whose playful nature and innocent curiosity represented everything pure that the facility was designed to corrupt and commodify for profit. An oppressive Friday evening settled over the Thai trafficking facility with the stifling humidity that characterized the region's monsoon season as the day's exploitation sessions finally ended and handlers retreated to their quarters, leaving the captive animals to endure another night of psychological torment through deliberate environmental manipulation designed to prevent rest and maintain chronic stress responses that kept them manageable for continued abuse. The concrete compound fell into the artificial quiet that characterized periods between active torture sessions, though automated systems continued their relentless assault on the animal's psychological well-being through irregular temperature fluctuations, unpredictable lighting changes, and recorded sounds of predators and distressed animals designed to maintain constant vigilance and prevent the restorative sleep that might allow recovery from daily trauma. Chai had learned to recognize these brief respites when direct human interference ceased, representing the closest approximation to peace that existed within their hellish environment. His remarkable memory allowed him to track handler schedules, feeding routines, and the various torture protocols that defined his existence, creating mental maps of when different forms of abuse were most likely to occur and when minimal safety might be possible. In the adjacent pen, Naran had positioned herself protectively over little Kamon, whose innocent curiosity about his concrete surroundings represented the only source of joy remaining in her traumatized existence. The lioness had developed hypervigilant maternal behaviors that went far beyond normal protective instincts, her every movement calculated to shield her cub from the handlers, who viewed him as future profit rather than a living being deserving of love and protection. The evening routine had become sacred ritual for both mother and cub. Naran would use soft, rumbling vocalizations to provide whatever comfort was possible within their concrete prison, while Kamon would respond with playful chirping that spoke of remarkable resilience despite the systematic cruelty that surrounded his young life from birth. These moments represented the only time when natural behavioral patterns could emerge despite the facility's designed suppression of normal animal instincts. The bond between Chai and the lion family had developed through months of shared suffering, their proximity allowing them to witness each other's abuse while providing whatever emotional support was possible through barriers designed to prevent comfort and maintain isolation that facilitated continued exploitation.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Chai's peaceful evening monitoring of the lion family was suddenly shattered when torrential monsoon rains began flooding the facility's inadequate drainage systems, rapidly transforming the concrete compound into a series of interconnected pools that posed mortal danger to animals trapped in cages designed without consideration for seasonal flooding that occurred annually in this region. The facility's criminal operators had prioritized profit over safety, creating death traps that became evident only during emergency situations. The rising water levels triggered immediate panic among the captive animals as their concrete prisons began filling with muddy floodwater that threatened drowning for creatures unable to escape their reinforced enclosures. Chai's elevated position in his pen provided him with clear views of the crisis developing throughout the facility, his remarkable intelligence allowing him to process the deadly implications of rapidly rising water levels. Through the chaos of flooding and animal distress calls, Chai's attention was drawn to Naran's pen, where the most heartbreaking crisis was unfolding. Little Kaman, whose 3-month-old body was too small to keep his head above the rising water, was struggling desperately against flood levels that would soon exceed his ability to survive, despite his mother's frantic attempts to lift him to safety within their concrete prison. The facility's poor construction had created a natural trap where Naran's pen sat lower than surrounding areas, making it a collection point for floodwater that rose faster than in other sections of the compound. The lioness's desperate attempts to boost Kaman onto higher surfaces were frustrated by the pen's design, which provided no elevated areas where a cub could escape the relentless water level increases. Chai found himself witnessing the most impossible situation of his captivity, watching helplessly as handlers remained safely in elevated quarters, while floodwater threatened to drown the innocent cub who had become a source of hope and joy during their shared nightmare of systematic exploitation. His massive frame strained against barriers that prevented him from using his strength to help creatures who had provided emotional comfort during the darkest moments of captivity. The sight of Kaman's desperate struggle and Naran's helpless maternal anguish was triggering responses in Chai that transcended normal survival instincts, reaching into protective centers that had been systematically suppressed through years of torture designed to break his spirit and eliminate natural behaviors that might interfere with profitable exploitation.
Became apparent through the facility's deliberate neglect of basic safety protocols that prioritized cost savings over animal welfare. The concrete drainage systems, designed to handle only minimal water flow, had been overwhelmed within minutes by monsoon rains that transformed the compound into a series of death traps for creatures whose cages prevented escape from rapidly rising flood levels. Little Kaman's struggle against the rising water revealed the calculated cruelty of his captivity. His pen had been constructed at the lowest point of the facility to facilitate waste drainage, making it a natural collection point for floodwater that rose faster than his tiny legs could navigate. The 3-month-old cub's desperate attempts to keep his head above water were becoming increasingly futile as exhaustion sapped his strength and the relentless flood levels continued climbing toward fatal depths. What made the scene even more devastating was Naran's obvious understanding of her cub's approaching death, combined with her complete inability to prevent it.
The lioness's frantic pacing and desperate vocalizations spoke of a mother whose protective instincts were being systematically violated by human-designed barriers that prevented her from saving her offspring from drowning in what should have been a survivable situation. The floodwater itself carried additional dangers beyond simple drowning. Contaminated with waste, chemicals, and debris from throughout the facility, it represented a toxic environment that threatened infection and disease, even if Kaman managed to survive the immediate drowning threat. The murky brown liquid spoke of systematic environmental neglect that prioritized profit over the health and safety of captive creatures. Most horrifying was the evidence of previous flooding events. Watermarks on concrete walls indicated this was a recurring problem that facility operators had chosen to ignore rather than address through proper drainage systems that would have prevented seasonal deaths of valuable animals. The criminal enterprise was willing to accept periodic losses rather than invest in infrastructure that would protect their inventory. As Kaman's struggles became increasingly weak and his small head began dipping below the surface more frequently, the reality of his situation was becoming undeniable. Without immediate intervention, the innocent cub would drown within minutes, while his mother watched helplessly from mere feet away, trapped by barriers designed to prevent exactly the kind of protective response that maternal love demanded.
Trapped within his reinforced enclosure, Chai found himself confronting the most devastating situation of his captivity, witnessing the slow drowning of an innocent cub whose playful nature had provided the only source of joy during years of systematic torture and exploitation. The elephant's remarkable intelligence made his helplessness even more torturous, as he could calculate exactly how long Kaman could survive in the rising floodwater and understand that conventional rescue was impossible without human intervention that seemed unlikely to materialize. His massive frame strained against steel barriers specifically engineered to contain creatures of his strength, knowing that his trunk's reach and natural swimming abilities could easily save the drowning cub, if not for concrete walls and metal bars designed to prevent exactly the kind of protective response that his gentle nature demanded. The sound of Kaman's increasingly weak struggles was triggering maternal-like protective instincts that transcended species boundaries and challenged every assumption about elephant emotional complexity. What made Chai's witness to the drowning most devastating was his ability to process Niren's psychological state as she watched her cub's approaching death. The lioness's desperate vocalizations and frantic pacing spoke of a mother whose sanity was being systematically destroyed by her inability to protect her offspring from preventable death caused by human negligence and deliberate cruelty. The bond that had developed between Chai and the lion family during their months of shared captivity transformed every moment of Kaman's struggle into personal anguish for the elephant, whose protective instincts had expanded to encompass creatures who had become his adopted family within the hellish environment that had stripped away every other source of comfort and connection. The sight of Niren's helpless circling and her obvious emotional devastation was triggering responses in Chai that went beyond normal captive animal stress reactions, reaching into psychological territories that challenged his understanding of survival, protection, and the bonds that suffering could forge between creatures of different species who shared nothing except systematic abuse at human hands. Chai found himself crossing psychological boundaries that separated survival-focused captivity responses from something approaching moral outrage and protective fury. The sight of deliberate negligence causing the death of an innocent creature was triggering responses that transcended personal survival concerns, creating emotional wounds that would prove more lasting and transformative than any physical torture he had personally endured during his decade of captivity.
Rather than remaining a helpless witness, Chai transformed into an active catalyst when something unprecedented occurred that challenged every assumption about elephant intelligence and problem-solving capabilities under extreme stress. Using his remarkable trunk flexibility and spatial reasoning, the massive elephant began systematically working to dismantle the barriers separating his enclosure from Neuron's flooded pen, applying calculated pressure to weak points in the facility's construction that his years of captivity had taught him to identify. Working with desperate efficiency born of paternal-like protective instincts, Chai used his tremendous strength to exploit structural vulnerabilities in the concrete walls that separated him from the drowning cub. His systematic approach to barrier removal demonstrated cognitive abilities that went far beyond simple panic responses, suggesting tactical thinking that prioritized rescue objectives over personal safety considerations. The breakthrough moment came when Chai's persistent efforts created a gap large enough for his trunk to reach through, allowing him to extend his most sensitive and versatile appendage toward the floodwater where Kamon was struggling to survive. Years of forced interaction with human trainers had taught him precise trunk control that now proved crucial for navigating the delicate rescue of a creature whose survival depended on gentle handling despite the urgency of his approaching death. What happened next defied every scientific understanding of elephant behavior and cognitive complexity. Chai began using his trunk to create a supportive sling around Kamon's tiny body, lifting the exhausted cub above the floodwater while simultaneously using his massive bulk to divert water flow away from Neuron's pen through strategic positioning that reduced the flooding in their immediate area. The elephant's coordinated rescue efforts demonstrated intelligence that transcended simple problem-solving, suggesting emotional investment and protective responses that challenged fundamental assumptions about interspecies relationships forged through shared trauma. His gentle manipulation of the nearly drowned cub showed remarkable understanding of the delicate nature of infant physiology combined with urgency that prioritized immediate life-saving over conventional safety protocols. As Chai successfully lifted Kamon to safety and began supporting the exhausted cub's breathing through gentle trunk movements, his actions created a bond between rescuer and rescued that would prove to have consequences far beyond the immediate crisis, setting in motion psychological responses that would challenge conventional understanding of animal gratitude, loyalty, and the dangerous transformations that liberation could trigger in traumatized predators.
The extraordinary rescue that unfolded challenged every principle of wildlife behavior and captive animal psychology, as Chai maintained his protective hold on little Kamon while simultaneously working to comfort Neuron, whose maternal stress responses threatened to compromise her ability to care for her rescued cub. The elephant's remarkable emotional intelligence allowed him to recognize that successful rescue required addressing both the physical and psychological trauma that the near drowning had inflicted on the lion family. Working with practiced efficiency that spoke of profound cognitive abilities, Chai used his trunk to gently transfer Kamon back to his mother once the floodwaters had receded enough to ensure safety, while maintaining protective positioning that demonstrated his commitment to defending the lion family against any future threats that might emerge from the facility's systematic negligence and deliberate cruelty. The days that followed revealed the depth of the bond that Chai's heroic intervention had created between elephant and lions. Kamon's recovery from his near-death experience was facilitated by the constant presence of his unlikely protector, whose gentle trunk provided comfort and security that helped the traumatized cub process the terror of almost drowning while surrounded by concrete walls that had nearly become his tomb.
But what was most remarkable was Naran's psychological response to Chai's rescue of her offspring. The lioness began displaying behavioral patterns that suggested she viewed the elephant not just as an ally, but as an integral part of her family unit, whose protection of Kaman had created obligations and loyalties that transcended normal interspecies relationships and entered territory that challenged scientific understanding of predator bonding. The rehabilitation process revealed that their shared trauma and Chai's heroic intervention had created psychological connections that would prove impossible to separate when freedom finally arrived. Naran's protective instincts had evolved to encompass the elephant who had saved her cub's life, creating a family structure that included interspecies bonds forged through life-and-death crisis. As weeks passed, it became clear that their rescue relationship had fundamentally altered all three animals' psychological makeup in ways that would prove crucial to understanding the terrifying events that would unfold when liberation finally freed them from the concrete prisons that had both confined and, paradoxically, protected others from what their trauma had created within Naran's increasingly possessive and territorial maternal instincts.
In the weeks following Kamon's rescue, the facility witnessed a transformation that defied every principle of captive animal psychology. What had begun as simple gratitude for Chai's heroic intervention evolved into something far more disturbing as Naran's maternal instincts underwent a dangerous metamorphosis that challenged fundamental assumptions about predator behavior and trauma-induced bonding. The lioness began displaying territorial behaviors that encompassed not just her biological offspring, but extended protective aggression toward Chai himself. Her psychological framework had restructured to include the elephant as an essential component of her family unit, creating possessive responses that went far beyond normal appreciation for rescue efforts. Most concerning was Naran's increasing aggression toward facility handlers who approached either Kamon or Chai during routine sessions. The lioness's protective responses escalated from defensive posturing to active threat displays that suggested she would kill anyone who posed danger to either member of her adopted family structure, regardless of consequences to herself. Her behavior patterns revealed systematic psychological conditioning that had transformed normal maternal protectiveness into pathological possessiveness. Years of systematic torture had corrupted normal lioness instincts, creating dangerous responses that prioritized absolute protection over balanced threat assessment. What the facility staff failed to recognize was that their systematic abuse had created a predator whose capacity for gratitude had been weaponized into something far more dangerous than natural maternal aggression.
6 months after Kamon's rescue, international wildlife authorities raided the trafficking facility, bringing veterinary teams prepared to relocate the traumatized animals to legitimate sanctuaries. The liberation operation promised freedom for creatures who had known nothing but systematic exploitation throughout their captive lives. The rescue team's assessments revealed profound psychological damage, but their focus remained on standard relocation protocols that prioritized physical health over the complex trauma bonds between elephant and lions. Their evaluation forms contained no categories for documenting the dangerous psychological dependencies that Naran had developed toward both Kamon and Chai. What the liberation team failed to recognize was that their separation procedures would trigger responses far more terrifying than anything witnessed during captivity. When handlers attempted to load Chai onto transport vehicles destined for an elephant sanctuary, Naran's protective instincts exploded into violence that defied every assumption about grateful rescued animals. The lioness launched herself against her transport cage with lethal fury, systematically destroying barriers that prevented her from defending what she perceived as an attempt to tear apart her trauma-forged family. Her attacks on rescue personnel demonstrated tactical intelligence that prioritized eliminating threats to Chai and Kamon over her own survival. Most chilling was Neuron's calculated targeting of veterinarians who approached either member of her adopted pride. Her systematic stalking behaviors revealed a predator whose maternal protectiveness had evolved into military-level threat assessment, turning her into a creature more dangerous in freedom than captivity.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.